world, how that translates into wonderful presentations. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then in February, we've got a fantastic speaker, Skip Lyle from Vermont, who invented the beaver deceiver and is passionate about the value of beavers as basically an ecological force. Beavers are second only to humans in their ability to transform the landscape. They can create incredible habitat. They can create water impoundments that recharge groundwater, and he's going to be fascinating. So I hope you'll join us in February. And we have, it's not on here, but Doug Tallamy, who's quite well-known entomologist from Delaware, will be speaking about insects, which are really a keystone in that they're at the base of the food chain, and everything above them really depends on their presence on the landscape. And he's a really good presenter. So you can read the description on the events page of our website. So moving on. Oops, there we go. So a huge thanks to Andrea and Julia for joining us tonight from the Wild Seed Project. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let them share their screen. The Wild Seed Project is a Portland-based organization. The executive director, Andrea Berry, is a passionate backyard gardener, amateur beekeeper, and keeper of chickens who loves nature and all growing things. And she has a long resume, too long to include here, but we're delighted to have her here. And Julia Frederick is on the board of the Wild Seed Project. She maintains a freelance practice designing native plant gardens and also works as a senior landscape architect at Mitchell & Associates in Portland. Her landscapes celebrate local ecology and enrich the relationship between humans and the natural world. So we're really delighted to have both of them here. It's obviously a topic, the topic of rewilding is obviously a really interesting topic to many people, as evidenced by the number of people who signed up. So with that, I will mute myself and, just with a note that because we have so many people, if you have questions along the way, please just put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. So over to you, Andrea and Julia.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline, and to everyone for joining us today. My name is Andrea Berry, and I am the fairly new executive director over at the Wild Seed Project. We're very excited to be walking you through this session today about rewilding in 10 action steps. We are a small organization ourselves, based in North Yarmouth, focused on bringing native plants back to the main landscape and beyond. Our primary work as Wild Seed Project is centered around the plants grown from wild seeds. So we hand collect wild seeds from native plants throughout the state. And then you can visit our shop. We have over 75 different species of hard to find native plants for sale via seed. And we teach people how to do this work themselves, how to do seed sowing during the winter, which is really different from me as a vegetable gardener. It's totally different process than what I have been used to, and I've been learning so much as the new ED here. And then we complement the physical collection and propagation of seeds and plants with education opportunities. We have a really robust website and blog, and are really excited to be helping everyone who's trying to do this work themselves, because we know that we can't do this as a small organization, just us. We all need to work together to rewild and to revitalize our landscapes. So thank you for joining us today. Before we jump in farther, I did want to start today off with a land acknowledgement, because it's so important for us to recognize that we're leading this class from unceded Wabanaki territory that we now call Maine. We recognize and honor the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the people of the Dawn, the Abenaki, the Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy. The Wabanaki people have been the stewards of this land for generations, and we recognize their inherent sovereignty and support their continued efforts to protect the land, water, plants, and creatures. And when we talk about rewilding, we are talking about the decolonization of our practices, our priorities, and our preferences and perspectives about the land. We as a people have made this land bend to our will through centuries of industrialization, urbanization, and commodification. And when we commit consciously to and begin to rewild, we're doing our part in decolonizing our practices and in giving back to the land from which we've taken so much. And we're putting ourselves into right relationship with nature. So in taking this class, in joining us today, and in starting to think about rewilding, you really are taking that decolonization practice one step forward and taking action on decolonization. So thank you for joining us today. Now, Caroline mentioned Doug Ptolemy and keystone species, and that really, this concept of keystone species is the origination of this term rewilding. So rewilding really came into the general lexicon in the 1980s, along the time when in Yellowstone National Park here in the US, we were seeing a huge decline in wolves, and therefore herbivores like deer and other species kind of running rampant throughout the Yellowstone landscape and really obliterating a lot of the herbivorous plants and other species out there. And so in this rewilding concept, we were rewilding by replacing and repopulating the top of the food web keystone species of wolves in order to keep the deer in check, in order to bring back the landscape and the plants and the other creatures there. And while it took a number of years for us to see the reemergence of this biodiversity, in particular from our perspective that we're focused on the fauna, on the flora there, that it really does make a shift. But this top-down model is actually the opposite of the direction that we're going to talk today. So when we at Wild Seed Project talk about rewilding, we continue to talk about keystone species, but we start on the bottom of the food web or of that food chain, where we're talking about a bottom-up approach, that trees and other plants are in fact keystone species. And we're so excited that Doug Ptolemy is coming to speak because so much of what we bring to this work of rewilding comes from a lot of the research that Doug Ptolemy has done. And while he talks about keystone species being insects, we really go one step further, and he does frame this in his new book about oaks, that keystone species are really the trees and other critical plants. So here in this example, we have red oak, and oaks are a critical keystone species that support hundreds and hundreds, over 400 different species of insects, which then support birds, which then support the larger predators, and it keeps going up and up. So when we're thinking about this rewilding approach, we really are looking at the bottom up and seeing plants as the basis for this food web. And when Doug Ptolemy talks about rewilding, he looks at this goal that he set out of 70% native plant biomass to support local food webs. And Julia is going to talk in a few minutes about starting on our conversation about trees, because when we're talking about biomass, it's not counting individual species of plants. We're actually physically talking about the bulk, the physicality of it. So that's the roots, the leaves, the trunks, the stems, all of those different pieces go into meeting that goal. So we know that the more that we can populate our landscapes, that we can fill our landscape from top to bottom, or from bottom to top really, with native plants, we're truly going to be supporting our local food webs and addressing biodiversity and creating sustainable habitats and ecosystems. So when we talk about rewilding here at Wild Seed Project, rewilding is definitely a verb. It's an action word. We're doing things, we're taking big steps to change the way that we are working and living in the landscape. So in one way, we're talking about the clear, cut and dry restoring of native plants. So, it's not traditional conservation. For us here, it's really bringing back the plants that restore habitat loss and support biodiversity moving forward. But it is also, so this is about what we plant. It's also about how we plant and how we manage our landscape. So we're talking about shifting our mindsets and our practices. So we're not mowing and blowing leaves as much. We're not using fertilizers. We're not doing those different pieces. And we'll talk about ways that you can take steps towards shifting your harmful habits that we all have. And then finally, it's about where we plant and how we plant together. So if we can join forces in rewilding, it really becomes a community action and something that we can all do together, because we all have a role, whether we own land or we don't, whether we live in a city or we live in a rural community, all of us have a part to play in this action or this act of rewilding. And so I'm going to pass it over to Julia to talk about some of the first steps. So we're actually going to go through 10 steps today, and Julia and I are going to bounce back and forth in that. But Julia's going to kick us off.
Hey, thanks, Andrea. So, planting native trees is one of the most simple and powerful actions you can take, and that's why it's our number one. As Andrea mentioned, the sheer amount of vertical mass that we will eventually get from planting native trees is really critical to reaching the rewilding goal of 70% native biomass. As you may know, trees help mitigate the effects of climate change by shading the ground and thus mitigating surface temperatures, reducing the heat island effect. Trees filter the air and reduce airborne pollutants, and they act as great sponges, soaking up storm runoff, reducing flooding and erosion, and protecting water quality. Native trees are definitely keystone species in supporting local food webs. And many different groups of native trees can be considered key. The oaks are number one, as Andrea mentioned. They can support between 400 to 500 plus species of moth and butterfly caterpillars. But there's several other groups of native trees that are very important as well. The willows, cherries, birches, and poplars. And those all support, at least 300 species of insects. For contrast, with a non-native sterile tree, such as the Bradford pear, which is a ubiquitous urban street tree, you might find only literally one single type of insect feeding on it. So you don't need to plant just huge canopy trees to make an impact. For example, the willow family has some shrubs as well as canopy trees. The pussy willow is a great example of the shrubs, and the black willow is a native canopy tree. So the cherry family also has some smaller, fast-growing trees if you don't have room for a large cherry canopy tree like the black cherry. So the black cherry you see here in the slide is the preferred host to the gorgeous large Cecropia silk moth, whose caterpillars need this tree for nourishment and shelter. Now, this moth creates silken web that hangs from the tree leaves to pupate in, but many species of caterpillars actually drop down from the tree and overwinter underneath the tree in the leaves. And that is why it's really important not to rake underneath your trees in the fall. So in terms of what age of tree to plant, larger nursery grown trees can be expensive and slower to establish than small, saplings. So you can really have fun rewilding with small seedlings. Watching them grow up is a delight. For example, I am introducing tiny oak seedlings into a grove of invasive Norway maples near my home. with the aim that someday these oaks will rise up and be able to compete with the Norway maples. You can grow your own seedlings, you can buy small saplings for cheap, and you can also rescue sprouted tree seedlings from inopportune locations, transplanting them. For my oak understory, I have rescued many sprouted acorns from the edge of local roads where they would have otherwise been run over or killed by road maintenance. So planting native trees is really important to rewilding. Not only do their leaves feed many species of caterpillars, which are in turn critical for birds raising their young, but their flowers feed bees and other pollinators, and their fruit, seeds, and nuts feed so many birds and mammals. So some tree bounties that humans and wildlife can enjoy include shagbark hickory nuts, which are delicious, serviceberry fruits, beech plums, and even the flowers of the redbud tree, which can be used as a beautiful salad garnish. So you can think about edible aspects when you choose which trees to plant. So next slide, please. When you think about planting a tree, a traditional scene often involves the circle of mulch in a lawn. And mulch at the base of the tree, it does retain moisture and it does protect the tree from lawnmowers, but the base of a tree could support a much richer landscape that accomplishes those same goals while adding biodiversity with native ground covers. So, when planting your trees and planning your landscape, we invite you to think like a forest with a layered community of shade-tolerant native ground covers, flowers, shrubs, and even understory trees underneath your big canopy trees. There's a whole system we can create around a tree. So, mimicking this forest-like system will improve soil structure. You can let the leaves fall and build organic matter. And green mulch ground covers also add nutrients to the soil and retain moisture. They protect from erosion and provide additional resources for pollinators. So, we can also plant trees in very small constrained areas. We can actually make a big impact in a small space. For example, this beech plum you see in this photograph is actually espaliate against a house wall next to a driveway. So it's a really creative, sort of beautiful way to use a native tree in a more traditional garden form. So if you want more ideas, I really encourage you to check out our Native Trees for Northeast Landscapes guide. Wild Seed Project puts out an annual publication every year, and previously we published a magazine, but we are transitioning to the format of this guidebook series, which we're really excited about. So I'm going to show you an aerial view of Portland, Maine, where our organization is based. And it shows you how barren, really, of trees and plants our cities often are, even when there's room for them. There's extra parking spaces everywhere. So when we envision rewilding this scene with native street trees, it shows you how much more beautiful and healthy these places can be. Okay, so number 2 in our rewilding action steps is shrink your lawn. And as many people in our society are beginning to realize, lawns require many resources that we should be more mindful of these days. Resources like water, fertilizer, and energy for mowing. And, pesticides and fertilizers used on lawns contribute to runoff, pollution in water bodies. And these non-native turf, closely cropped, unfortunately, it's really a dead zone for our native pollinators and wildlife. The lawn is really a dead zone. So in our new, formulation, we can think of lawns, yes, as necessary and functional part of our landscape, but for specific uses, not as a dominant default. So if we all shrink our lawns in half, as Doug Tallamy of Bringing Nature Home advises, we can think of lawns really as specific outdoor rooms for gathering or pathways to draw us through the landscape. And then the other unnecessary borders and areas can be converted into other types of planting, like meadows. So one way to achieve a meadow is to release your lawn and stop mowing while overseeding it with really vigorous native wildflowers and grasses that can compete with the turf. Examples of these vigorous natives are, black-eyed Susan coneflower species, aster species, partridge pea, and purple lovegrass. Now, this method is really dependent on whether or not you have a lot of invasives nearby and whether invasive species seeds are going to be blowing over onto your property. And it also sort of depends on your knowledge of native and non-native plants and which plants to edit out and which to encourage. So this method, it's a little bit more of a slow burn. It takes several years and it's more of an advanced technique. But another way to create a meadow is sheet mulch. You put down a nice layer of cardboard so no sun gets through and cover with like 2 to 6 inches of mulch, or aged leaf mulch or wood chips. And you leave it in place for a full growing season so that it breaks down over the summer. And then you can seed or plant through it in the fall. Alternatively, you could put it down in the fall and then plant it in early spring. So, as an alternative to a meadow, there's also talk of these lawn alternative ground covers that one can purchase as small plugs that might come in a tray of 50 plants and plant over a large area. Now, this low growing kind of a carpet effect has a tidy look and it doesn't need much maintenance. Although, it can handle foot traffic, but it's really not a replacement for a lawn.
Julia?
Yep.
I'm just jumping in to say someone has requested that you slow down just a tiny bit in your delivery. You're packing a lot of information into it. And I'll just say I am taking notes and we'll write this up and post it on our on the news page. So we'll try to reinforce all the information that Julia is giving us. So
yes, thank you for the advice. I have a lot of information to get through here. Okay, so examples of these low growing, spreading native species might include Pennsylvania sedge or wild strawberry, foam flower, three-tooth cinquefoil, wavy hair grass, pussy toes, depending on the sunlight situation and the moisture situation. And so, these alternatives can't handle a lot of foot traffic, but they're not going to need fertilizer, watering, or mowing like a lawn would. So what's even more beneficial than, say, this ground cover carpet is to convert your lawn into true layers of plants, like that forest-inspired landscape I mentioned. You can either sheet mulch and plant it with a variety of native plants of various heights and types, trees, shrubs, ground covers. Or if you already have plant beds, you can really work on hemming in your lawn by slowly expanding your plant beds over time. And lawn to layers is really the way to go if you want to create the most beneficial ecological impact in shrinking your lawn. So you're increasing your biomass and you're creating many, many niches for pollinators. So I'm going to show you 2 visions that I hope will inspire you to work towards shrinking lawns. This one is just the home of a friend, and my friend has envisioned it as an edible native landscape, blueberries and pawpaw trees, ostrich ferns, and even a rain garden collecting roof water. And the other vision I'm going to show you, I created myself. This is a local bank lawn, and I imagine it as, a pollinator garden park that is a destination for the whole community. And so number 3 in our rewilding steps is fill every open niche. And this is a really creative and fun way to rewild, especially if you don't have a lot of room to work with. For example, if you rent an apartment, You can take on the challenge by cramming in and packing every corner with as much native diversity as you can. So flower boxes, native plant pots on your steps, native vines are great for tall, narrow spaces, or you can twine them up an existing tree, or you can twine a vine, planting it at the base of a telephone pole. You can also take over the hell strip of lawn at the edge of the street, planting it with super tough native plants like Canada anemone or black-eyed Susan. So by taking these creative niche-filling steps, you are really increasing the biomass of native plants dramatically in a place that might not have had any to begin with. So on this slide here is a great example of stacking, packing, and layering natives into a really small urban landscape. There's a huge amount of biodiversity here with small trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants. So, when we fill every open niche, we can also think about returning a little bit of wildness to our urban landscapes in the form of forests. So this is a fascinating movement called the Miyawaki mini forest method from Japan, which strives to increase productive forests by densely packing a variety of native tree seedlings on abandoned remnant lots. And it's been shown that in 5 to 10 years, the biodiversity in these plots will reach almost the same level as a natural mature forest.
All right. Thank you, Julia. So I'm going to give Julia a little breather now and go through some of the next steps. And this next step here is called targeting pollinators to support. So, so much can be done with forests and with all different ways to think about your landscape that it can get a little bit overwhelming. And one of the things that I find really accessible is this concept of targeting a specific pollinator. We see that a lot with folks who are putting in monarch butterfly gardens and, filling with different types of milkweeds, and critically thinking about not only supporting the showy butterfly stage of one of the species' life cycle, but also thinking about supporting where are the eggs laid, what do the caterpillars eat, where do they pupate, where do they then grow and continue their life cycle. So thinking really critically about how we can really bring the whole life cycle of the pollinator into our landscape design. This includes being thoughtful about the keystone plants for specific pollinators. We talked about the Cecropia moth and, monarchs. There are so many different species out there that are critical keystone herbivorous plants. And here we have examples of goldenrods and asters, which are two of the most critical. So Julia, I don't know about you, but our program manager, Anna, who also does landscape design, says every single design that she does with native plants, she finds it really important to have at least one species of goldenrod and one species of aster. Goldenrods is an example, and asters can host hundreds of species of moths and butterflies whose caterpillars eat the foliage and that provide really late season. In most cases, if you look out, well, probably not right now, but maybe a few weeks ago, our landscapes were full of goldenrods and blooming asters, and there are still some that are in bloom. So because they're late in the season, they're creating opportunities for late season forage for bees and wasps, as you can see in these examples. For an important thing to note, and this is something that I was really happy to learn because my garden is full of goldenrod, and I was blaming all of my fall seasonal allergies on goldenrod. And the reality is that goldenrods are not actually the source of my or your seasonal allergies, because they are pollinated by bees and wasps. Their pollen is actually sticky, moist, and heavier. It's not distributed by the wind, and it's instead designed to stick to those pollinator bodies. So the reality is that their allergies are probably connected to something else that's blooming now, likely ragweed and wind pollinated grasses. So we can take that off of our list for the reason why we wouldn't put goldenrod into our gardens. Now, the Canada goldenrod can get really leggy, and so there are lots of different examples. There are many, many different species of goldenrod that you can consider. And one of the things that we like to think about is whether it should be in dry or wet, whether it needs sun or shade. And so there's kind of a goldenrod for every single situation. And then when you're thinking about design for your landscapes, there are also some goldenrods that can be high that for me, I put in the backs of my garden spaces. And then I have some goldenrods that are closer into the front of the garden spaces that are shorter and really nicely suited there. The same thing goes for asters, where there's lots of different asters that bloom at all different times during the season or during the fall, and can really add some beautiful color as we head into this colder time. So when we're thinking about supporting pollinators, for example, this is our example here of the Baltimore checker spot butterfly, which relies specifically on the white turtlehead plant to lay its eggs. Its caterpillars feast on the turtle heads, but then they go down to the leaf litter to oh, my dog's joining. And they go down to the leaf litter to overwinter, and then over the following season, they'll then come back out, have their chrysalis on the turtle head, and then become the butterfly. And so there's so much opportunity for us to think about pushing, if I put my turtle heads into the space, there's into my gardens, there is this great opportunity to bring in this additional species of butterfly. So remember, as Julia talked about before, though, these species are dropping into the leaf litter for their overwintering period. And so it's not just putting these plants in the ground to support the beautiful butterflies, but it is also thinking about how you're managing your landscape. So when we're thinking about supporting and targeting pollinators, there's lots of different opportunities, again, to do this, where we can think about all different types of landscapes, retail spaces, spaces along sidewalks, where we can fit in amazing plants that are supporting all different types of pollinators and to really bring our landscapes to life. Next, I want to talk about number 5 on our list, which is changing your maintenance regimen. Here, it's really thinking about not just what are we putting in the ground right now, but it is thinking, or in the spring, it's thinking about all the different times then we're interacting with our landscape. Now, lots of us leave all of our maintenance to the fall. I know for many years, I have spent almost all of my beautiful fall weekend days raking leaves. And this is a real opportunity for us to rethink what it means to be cleaning up our garden and to be changing our spaces. In fact, if we are centering all of our cleanup in the fall, we're actually doing the most damage. This is the worst time that we could be doing our landscape cleanup, because leaves are critical for the overwintering of so many different species. We want to remember that blowing these leaves, packaging them up, putting them in bags, sending them away is probably killing huge numbers of caterpillars that are down there trying to survive the winter, in addition to lots of other types of species like salamanders and other creatures who are using that leaf litter for warmth. They're using it for protection during the season. Remember also that leaves out in the landscape allow us to bring lots of organic matter into the landscape or into our ground. And they're going to help to insulate the plantings that you have in your gardens. And then finally, you know, we're just really focusing on the leaf cleanup here, but the amount of energy and the amount of noise pollution that goes into blowing your leaves and packing up those leaves with gas-powered blowers is really problematic for the environment overall. And I just want to think about, and I love this concept, that it may not be that you have an excess of leaves, it's probably that you have too much lawn. And that's a real reality here, that our landscapes, our wild landscapes rely on the leaf litter coming down from the trees. And that if we see it as really problematic, it's because we've so transformed our landscapes that they're no longer providing the fullest function. In addition to changing that leaf pickup regimen, I want you to think about changing what it means to really like put your garden to bed at the end of the year. So many of these hollow pithy stems that you have on plants are actually places where native bees and wasps will overwinter or lay their eggs. And so if we're pulling down all of that standing vegetation, we're taking away a lot of those habitats for those creatures to reproduce and to live out their full life cycle. Additionally, if we leave the heads of flowers like purple cone flowers, that's providing really critical winter food for birds, and providing them and other smaller species cover in the winter from predators where they don't have all the leaves and other things to hide under and around. Now, when we think about changing our regimen, it doesn't have to just be leaves everywhere and branches that have come down from trees everywhere. There is an opportunity for you to be creative. Now, this is an example of the Hidden Valley sculpture by Gary Smith out at Garden in the Woods in Massachusetts, where he's taken all of the fallen branches and turned it into something really beautiful that adds elements and dynamicism to the environment when you look into the woods. So it's this beautiful, somewhat managed landscape that also has this powerful art in it. So everything that falls to the floor of the forest is actually useful, whether it's the sticks and logs that provide shelter for small creatures, provide organic matter and are critical for decomposers, or the leaves that we've already talked about. And I like the concept here of thinking about this as like not art, or not trash, but art. Man, I botched that line. Not trash, but art. And you have this opportunity to reframe for the winter and to bring different dynamic landscapes and beauty in. All right, I am going to mute myself and pass back over to Julia for our next few steps.
Okay, so number 6 on our rewilding action steps is add wildlife friendly features, and those could include some that Andrea just mentioned, like hollow stems, fallen logs, brush piles, or even dead standing trees, also known as snags, are really beneficial to wildlife. But you could also add things like wildlife boxes for nesting, and of course, providing fresh water, and particularly running water, is a great way to attract more birds and pollinators. I really like this example you see on the screen, which is channeling roof runoff through a downspout, and it's pouring into a satellite dish, which is creating a sort of interactive bird bath there. So, bright outdoor lighting can really harm nocturnal wildlife, such as migrating birds overhead or moths trying to navigate at night. So it can also disrupt circadian rhythms of many other creatures. And consider limiting your lighting and choosing low, dark sky compliant fixtures that don't spread light upwards. So number 7 on our rewilding action steps to take is stop fertilizing and using pesticides. Now, this is really one of the lowest hanging fruit for rewilding. And these, fertilizer and pesticides are both really unnecessary in maintaining a beautiful, healthy native garden. Fertilizers might make sense for annual farm crops or exotic species, but with natives, we really just need to choose the plant species that are suited to our space. So if we consider our soil types, sunlight and moisture levels, then we just need to find the perfect native plants that will thrive in that habitat situation. So if you think your soils are very, very poor, for example, urban fill, then you can add nutrients slowly over time through decomposing leaf litter or leaf mulch or compost. But keep in mind that many native plants really don't need extra nutrients, and many can grow in very poor soil. So too many nutrients can actually make some native perennials grow tall and floppy and then invite weeds underneath them. So one thing that's important to note is that, both synthetic and natural organic fertilizers both pollute water bodies when they run off from agricultural and developed lands, causing harm like toxic algae blooms. So abandoning pesticides is a no-brainer in my opinion, because we really want native insects to be munching on the leaves of our native plants. And we don't want these insects to be poisoned with the poison working its way up the food chain, harming birds and that are feeding their young with these insects. So another thing is we can really become wise consumers when we purchase native plants from nurseries. So we should inquire to the staff about their use of pesticides and fertilizers. Unfortunately, the majority of nurseries do use pesticides, and some use systemic pesticides that can remain in the plant for years, which is really unfortunate. So we need to educate these commercial nurseries that we would like, plants without pesticide use. So for container grown plants, yes, nurseries do need to use a small amount of fertilizer, but many nurseries really over fertilize plants, which pumps them up so that they don't adapt as well to the garden. So number 8 in our rewilding action steps is remove or forgot this slide, which is, if we want to bypass some potentially harmful practices that nursery plants might have experienced, like pesticide and over fertilizing, we can grow our own plants from seed. So then we know that there's no pesticide used, and we know that they're going to adapt really well to our garden. And also it's much, much cheaper. You can get 50 seedlings in one little pot that you sow. Okay, so our number 8 step is remove invasive plants, which many of us are probably involving, already battling invasives in our home landscapes, and deciding which removal method to use, and what area to target first can be really tricky. With the rewilding movement, let's think about all the human power that we can harness to remove invasive plants, all the community partnerships and volunteer opportunities, that could make it less daunting. For example, this organization in Portland, Rewild Maine, harvests invasive bittersweet and repurposes it for basket weaving. We could get our neighbors together and have invasive plant removal parties. We could have school kids do it for projects. They absolutely love it. It has a real sense of accomplishment when we do things together. But when you remove invasive plants, you really need to replant the area with those rugged, fast-spreading native species that will be able to compete with the invasives and keep them at bay. Wild Seed Project on our website has many plant lists, and a really good one is this list of plants to plant after removing invasive species. For example, Wild Seed Project has had great success in overplanting the native shrub purple flowering raspberry over Japanese knotweed roots. And if you continue to trim the knotweed underneath as the raspberry shrub grows up, within a year or two, the raspberry is out competing the knotweed, which is really great to see.
All right. And we're in the home stretch here. So we've talked a lot about the physical practices that you can do in your landscapes, what you can be choosing to plant, where you can plant, how you can plant. Important in this concept of rewilding, or this act of rewilding, is the social part of it. It's who you're doing it with and how you're communicating about this process of rewilding. We feel like joining forces with your neighbors and spreading the word about what it is you're doing and why it's important is just as critical as doing the work. So often you'll see someone who is turning their lawn into meadow. I'm a good example here. I have been working to turn big portions of my lawn into meadow, and my neighbor has been coming over to my house when we're out to mow my lawn because he felt so strongly that it was over mowed. We have young kids, which you clearly saw coming in, and he was like, oh, they really don't have the time to get to their yard, and so they're letting it go. And so I can do the nice thing and come and mow. We're intentionally doing that. And after putting up our native habitat for pollinators, do not mow sign like you see here, our neighbor actually came over, apologized for mowing, which, was very sweet, but he didn't have to do because he was we were very appreciative of the way he was trying to take care of us, but apologized and understands now. It opened up an opportunity for a real conversation about what it is that we were doing, why we were doing it. And it led to this conversation about how many more birds we were seeing in both of our yards because of what we were doing in our space of not mowing and letting our space go over to meadow. There is so much that can be done in making clear what your intentions are. So that could be signs. We have for sale in our shop, both these do not mow signs. And in fact, I think we're out of these trial balloon leave the leaves signs, but you can download it for free on our website and print and make your own, because we want to give people some tools to be able to show what it is that they're doing. But there are lots of other ways that you can do that without having to put up the actual instructions for other folks. Mown edges, so mowing the edge around an intentional space that you're leaving to go more wild, is a great way to indicate what it is that you're doing and to show people that, oh, really, you did mean it. Making some type of clearly defined edge, whether it was like that the chicken wire with the leaves inside of it from one of the previous slides, or a small wattle fence or small fencing that goes along the edge of a space that you're intending to leave wild, that you've put in plants that you're looking to incorporate into your rewilding approach. We believe all of this sparks opportunity for conversation in a really non-confrontational way. I could have gone over to my neighbor and yelled and been like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? That's not okay. But instead, it opened us up for this opportunity to have a really constructive conversation, showing folks what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. It gives them a sense of what's happening and that it's in process and in progress. Nature's slow. Growing plants is slow. We need to help people who don't have that natural gardening patience to understand that this is going to take time, but we have a vision and we are moving forward with that. We also really encourage you to think about social media as a great way to share about what you're doing. Hashtags are awesome. If you're using social media and looking to build community, you can use tools like the Nextdoor app, share in some of the, there's great Facebook groups. There's lots of stuff going on Instagram that is helping folks to be part of a bigger movement to rewild, instead of feeling like we're all doing this by ourselves and how can we possibly be making an impact. When you join forces with your neighbors, you also have this opportunity to create multiple pieces of the landscape. We are, what I'm doing in my yard, and 3 houses down the street is where the new Wild Seed Project office is, and we'll be rewilding that space as well. And in connecting those 2 spaces, we are creating areas for creatures to go from my house to that next space. We're creating these habitat corridors, these wildlife corridors, in order to create the fullness of a space for wildlife. If we are just one house in the middle of a city who is doing this work, it's going to take a long time for the species, for the different creatures to find our land and find that habitat. And it's probably not going to be enough to support the fullness of the biodiversity that we need or that we want. But if we do it, and a few houses down, our neighbors do it, and a few houses behind us, our neighbors do it, and a few people down the road do it, and the business down the block does it, that creates these beautiful habitats and creates a patchwork of spaces where creatures can go from place to place to place, which is really what we want to see. The more connected habitats we have, the more pollinators and other wildlife, and that's something pretty beautiful and pretty awesome. So when we think about open spaces in our communities, let's not forget those corporate spaces, the retail spaces, or the vacant spaces, and what we could possibly do with it to create spaces for everyone to come together within a more wild landscape. And so finally, I'll leave you with the biggest of pictures, which is thinking about either our local civic associations, our local governance and municipalities, and even our statewide and national legislatures. There is so much opportunity to think about bringing this to the forefront and to get everyone involved. In 2015, Wild Seed Project partnered with the Conway School to create what is now the Portland Pollinator Vision Plan that looked at the entire city and assigned a wildlife value to all of the different spaces within the city and incorporated in what was happening on the land, different land use practices. Was it a road? Was it a parking lot? Was it a residential home or a corporate space? And built out this plan to demonstrate the vibrant opportunities to bring a rewilding approach to the city of Portland. It helped us to see how we can create connected wildlife corridors and just to paint this vision of the opportunity that sits in front of us here in the city of Portland and throughout our state. And then we took it a step further. And in 2018, we started a partnership with the Maine Department of Transportation and created a roadside guide that both looked at plants that we wanted to support within all of the roadsides within the Department of Transportation's purview, as well as different management regimens. How can we reduce the mowing or change the mowing cycle so that we're not favoring invasive plants or exotic plants, but that instead we're favoring the life cycle of native plants, that we can allow species to thrive and we can manage and mitigate the invasives that are so prevalent on our roadsides and in particular on the sides of the highways. We know that if the mowing, the obsessive mowing that's happening on the sides of our roads is reduced, that would allow road crews, it wouldn't put road crews out of business. Instead, it would allow road crews the opportunity to deal with harmful invasives and to really bring back the lush environment that could exist on our roadsides. So that's our giant 10 steps. But what we hope they are is, even though they're big and they build and they grow, that each of you will go through this class today and have picked out one or two that's going to be your first step. And, you know, I would recommend that as we're thinking about the fall, considering leaving the leaves might be a great first thing you can do that'll free up some nice time on your weekends moving forward. But before we close and go to questions, I'm going to hand it back over to Julia to talk about a project that's happening right on the Cathans River.
Thanks, Andrea. I do want to leave enough time for questions, so I'm just going to quickly talk about this case study project, Bodenham Waterfront Park on the Cathans in Bodenham. And I really want to show you an example of a larger scale rewilding effort on a really challenging site. You know, this is a former industrial chemical plant and a public works lot for the town. And the site still actually has the huge foundation, the huge concrete slab of this chemical plant just underneath the surface of the soil. And there's also still some dump sites in the wetlands in the park. So, you know, it's a highly disturbed floodplain, and the town now owns the property, and this project has been a collaborative effort between the town, the community, Richardson Associates Landscape Architects, Master Planning, and Mitchell and Associates Design. I'm on the Mitchell design team, and we're currently in construction documents. And so around the perimeter of the park, where the concrete slab is not, we were able to design rehabilitated shoreline and native wet meadows with native tree and shrub collections that will draw people across the park and sort of educate them about floodplain habitat. But in the center of the park, where you see these events, the berms and the play area, we had to get creative about park planning because we have this huge concrete slab underneath. So we wanted to create more opportunities for native plant habitat in this area and a more interesting topography. So we're actually designed these low landscape berms that are sort of ensconcing the lawns and the play area. And what we're going to do is repurpose some concrete from the foundation, turn it to rubble, and use it to shape these low-lying hills, which will showcase native plants that are adapted to dry conditions, as sort of as a counterpoint to the wetland adapted plants that will be introduced elsewhere in the park. So I just have a few visualizations of our native, dry meadow berms that are shaping space in the park. Okay.
All right. Well, we so want to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope you all feel encouraged and empowered and picked out one or two things that you're going to do on your own landscape and with your neighbors and friends. We want to encourage you to take our pledge to Rewild, which we know will be sent out as a link after this session. We have an interactive map, or a soon-to-be interactive map, that shows everyone. There's more than 1,000 people in our communities who have taken the pledge to Rewild and put themselves on that map. You can see how you're part of the movement and how your neighbors and the businesses in your communities are getting involved. Now we'll send out a list of resources, but there are definitely lots of different resources on the Wild Seed Project website and different readings that we will recommend. And we'll make sure you get access to those. And we encourage everybody, if you're thinking about the first step, is thinking about our Native Trees for Northeast Landscapes guide. Great, so we're happy to answer questions with the remaining time, and just really appreciate all of you joining us this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. That was a ton of information. And so, as I said, we will try to write up a lot of that. We will also, when we send a link to the recording, we'll also send a link to your website. I've spent a good amount of time on Wild Seed's website, and there is a ton of information. You just have to sort of dig around in it depending on what you're looking for. So a couple of questions. Would those arranged branches, the ones at Garden in the Woods, I think, in the woods, work to encourage habitat?
Yes, I think so. I mean, so one of the things that we see in lots of native garden designs, intentional garden designs, is the leaving of boughs and branches on the ground. They, if they are the pithy stems, then they do create those spaces for, ground bees to lay eggs or to overwinter in. And they will reinforce the decompose and go into the humus of the soil. So they'll make all of the spaces more rich and vibrant. They also do create little hiding spaces. And, in the case of that, there's places for mice and other creatures to live within in a way that does create additional habitat. It's slightly shifted from what it would be in the general distribution, but it's a good opportunity for us to leave the stuff there and to also please our own eyes and what we see as beautiful in those spaces.
And I would just add that I do this a lot. I mean, it depends somewhat on where you live, but I live out in a more rural area, but I just I take branches. If I'm pruning a fruit tree, I just stack them up in one area. And a friend of mine who's a wildlife biologist says that what you just said, Andrea, that it creates habitat for certain critters, and a lot of times that will draw in the owls and the predatory birds that will hang out and just wait for one of them to skitter out from underneath the wood pile. So there's a lot of value, and you can create them in a way that looks intentional and doesn't just look like a pile of sticks. So next question, do you want to comment on, in quotes, jumping worms, commercial nurseries, and native landscaping? I don't know what jumping worms are.
Julie, you want to take that?
Oh, sure. I know that people are very worried about these jumping worms and invasive species, which is quickly spreading across the US in nursery potted material. And as far as I know, it has not reached Maine yet, but it is certainly something that we should be vigilant about. And I think growing, is another argument for growing our own seedlings for sure.
Okay. Let's see. Someone says, don't plant Canada anemone in a garden bed unless you don't mind it taking over your property.
It's a very aggressive native species, but it's great for certain purposes, like a constrained, urban site that's really tough.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of really aggressive native plants, and that is part of the beauty of native plants in a lot of ways. There are native plants that you can select to be rather self-contained, but then we also have this opportunity to balance out and put native plants in spaces where we're okay with them running and spreading and building up a healthy population. So it's a balance.
Next question, are seed bombs effective for getting a native meadow started?
They are and they aren't. They're not. So the Wild Seed Project line or rule would be seed bombs are great, but they're not as good as growing your own seeds in pots over the winter and then planting them as individual plants into a meadow. They're, spreading seed through seed bombs are a great way to get into a really large space, but you're going to have a much lower germination rate than you would if you're doing it in a tended pot, or if you're so it's a trade-off. It would be a huge amount of work to grow for a massive meadow in pots, so it's a balance.
Yeah, and I will say that seed bombs could be a nice part of your meadow establishment if you're releasing your lawn. If you're releasing part of your lawn, and you're throwing some seed bombs in there, the moisture in the clay substrate that the seed bomb is set into would give those seeds more of a fighting chance, I think, than just sprinkling them around the seeds themselves.
And we do offer some seed bomb kits and seed bomb workshops. So we're definitely not anti seed bombs, but just know that you'll have less germination rate than you will if you're doing them in your own individual pots.
Someone asks if low bush blueberries figure into the rewilding, and I just want to take the opportunity to say that I have started growing low bush blueberry on my sort of dry, sandy front, section of my dry, sandy front yard, and they're doing great.
Yes, exactly. They're a great native plant. One reason that Wild Seed Project does not sell low bush blueberry seeds on our site is just because there's so many different native low bush blueberry species that we're not certain that we can identify them properly. So we don't want to, you know, just lump them all together. So that's why we don't sell them in our shop.
And I just like, even in the case of creating food forests, for example, which is a big trend and part of the rewilding general movement, you know, one of the reasons why we do these 10 steps and we encourage people to take steps to rewild is because we shouldn't be expected, and we don't expect that everyone will go whole hog and only plant natives. You know, I'm the executive director of this organization, and I've got 15 apple trees that I've grafted and planted in my yard. And I do a vegetable garden. That all of those different pieces, for me, it's creating that biodiversity that complements the influx of native plants that I'm putting in my space. So you can do it in steps and move in that direction. But the great part about blueberries is they're also native, so it fits that plants for food and the movement towards more natives.
So there are still quite a few questions, so we should try to cover them quickly. Are there recommended natives that can contend with invasive bittersweet?
What do you think, Julia?
Yeah, bittersweet is certainly a formidable foe. You know, I might try the purple flowering raspberry that I mentioned. We had success with combating knotweed simply because the purple flowering raspberry shrub has such big, beautiful leaves that they really shade out the ground underneath it. You could try that.
Also, I know that some people will, if you can do it, if the issue is regeneration, a lot of times if a bittersweet plant starts climbing, all you have to do is basically cut the big stem, and that just, takes care of all of the top growth. The bigger issue is often the regeneration underneath, and some people will mow that for a while. And if you keep mowing it repeatedly, eventually you're going to exhaust the food stored in the roots, and it will at least cut it back. And then depending on how large an area it is, you can cover it up with black plastic and just starve it that way. All right, moving on. How do you balance leaving the leaves with concerns about ticks?
That is a great question, and one that we get asked all of the time. And Julia, I'll ask for you to also jump in here. Ticks are a part of our environment, and we often hear folks saying, well, I'm mowing down all of my property, I'm blowing all of my leaves to make sure that we don't have access to ticks. So often we're seeing folks get ticks from walking in the woods, even from, I've gotten some when I've been in my vegetable garden. There are so many different ways to get ticks that we do recommend just care on all of these different sides. If we can create a really healthy food web through the biodiversity that exists, we're going to increase some of the predators that eat ticks, like possums and other creatures. We also can increase the apex predators that are eating things like the white-footed mouse that is bringing so many of the ticks to us. So if we can build up the biodiversity of our spaces, we're actually going to, because so much of the tick problem is because of the host species, like the deer and the mice, that if we can create a system that helps to sustain and manage their populations, we are going to be able to manage and mitigate the ticks. But, there's a balance. There's always a balance there. And I think that's a really personal choice and balance. We would rather that you clean up your leaves and keep your grass mowed shorter than to spray with pesticides, so there's different levels to which you would address that.
And one person farther on suggested creating paths, so mowing pathways, and stay in the pathways and out of the grass. It's also worth noting that if you have barberry planted as a shrub in your yard, barberries are supposedly, I think there's been some research done that shows that there are higher populations of ticks underneath barberry because of the spines, mice like to hang out there, and a lot of times the mice are carrying the ticks. So it might be a good idea to get rid of your barberry, which is invasive anyway. Let's see, in an area that is alongside a road that already grows tall grass, do you have to dig up and plant for variety, or could you broadcast seeds? I think they're asking, basically, how do you go about like redoing the health strip or a roadside area without having to dig up the turf?
Right, I can answer that. I mean, you could do either method. The more intensive digging up and planting would take, more time, more money, but it would be probably more successful at increasing the biodiversity of native plants. But you could overseed with, like I mentioned in the meadow creation, you could overseed with these particularly vigorous natives that really can compete with non-native grasses. So and natives that germinate very easily, like black-eyed Susans and certain species of asters and goldenrods.
Okay, great. Someone says that crazy jumping worms were ID'd in Brunswick.
Oh,
So,
no.
Anyway, someone says, how do we begin talking to our towns about adopting more rewilding in public spaces? I live in Belfast and see so much opportunity here. I'm just not sure where to start.
We believe one of the best places to start is with the Parks and Rec committee or with a small planting, whether you have many of our towns have garden clubs that are putting in gardens in different spaces and working with them. You can also think about working with classes in schools. Here in North Yarmouth, we have good relationships with the schools, and we're talking about putting in a monarch pollinator garden outside of the elementary school for students to use in part of their monarch life cycle classes. So there's lots of different places to go. Many towns are already thinking about invasive management in some of their public parks, and especially the more wild public parks. And so the folks who are doing that work are a great place to start, and often going to be really excited about your energy and the efforts.
And I think part of it too is I suspect that for some towns, they opt for the mow option just because it feels simpler. But I think if you, as Andrea suggested, if you start to show that it's, I can think of one place in Brunswick. It drives me nuts every time I bike past it. It's a public space and it's just grass. And it looks hot and unwelcoming. And I think about how just having one tree there to create shade in the summer, because it's a very sunny spot, would be a huge advantage, and creating little islands of sort of plant life. And so I think it's just it's an educational process, and you just have to go out and start letting the folks that are leading your town and the staff that natives are important. And I think the idea of involving school classes is a great one, because everybody loves school projects. And particularly if you can go to a town and say, I have a whole bunch of volunteers who are ready to go in and do some plantings, they might welcome that. So,
and it's harder to say no to kids. I also say the roadside guide, the DOT roadside guide that I mentioned, that is available on our website and is a great resource to share with your municipality wherever you live.
Great. I think that's it for the questions. So I just want to thank both of you, Julia and Andrea. That was a ton of information and really valuable. So we will send a link to the recording to all the registrants, and we will, Andrea and Julia, if you can send me a copy of those resources, we can include those and a link to your website in our follow-up email to folks, which should go out in the, I would say by the end of the week.
Great.
So anyway, thank you so much for sharing all that wonderful information. That was really, really great.
Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
So thanks everyone for joining us. And they talked a lot about Doug Talmy, and he'll be with us in March. So don't miss that. So thanks all. There's a lot of things in the chat. Some thank yous to both of you. So
thank you.
Well, thank you all.
have a great night, everyone.